welcome to a super special episode. This is a powerhouse of a woman who I interviewed a few months back, and she is one of the most community-centric designers and creatives I've ever met, and she's a wonderful human being. This episode is with Inbar Kishoni. She's the Citi Bike Community and Equity Programs Manager at Lyft. She's an urban planner obsessed with improving how people can be a part of shaping the cities they live in. And you will definitely see that reflect in the episode as we're having a conversation. As the Community and Equity Program Manager on Lyft's Citi Bike team, she works on increasing access to the Citi Bike system through community grants, adaptive programming, and the reduced fare bike share program. Prior to that, she spent 11 and a half years at NYC DOT, first as a project manager in their bicycle program and ultimately serving as their first ever Director of Public Engagement and Program Development. She created NYC DOT's Street Ambassador Program, a lean and agile group of 10 multi-lingual outreach specialists that became integral to the way the agency communicates about and builds support for projects. It's a great case example of how community engagement should be done in large public offices, but you'll hear more about that. Inbar holds an MA in Urban Planning from Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation program, and a BA in Geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's proud to serve as board secretary for the Center for Urban Pedagogy, who we also love. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Inbar Kishoni. Inbar is the Citi Bike Community and Equity Programs Manager at Lyft. Hello, Inbar.
Hi, it's me. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
Thanks for making the time. We were so looking forward to this conversation, so we're so happy you're here. For our audience too, please tell us more about yourself and your background.
Okay, well, I always introduce myself as a geographer first, and then I became an urban planner, and I was very lucky as a young little high schooler that I was exposed to real geography early. So I was really like learning about my built environment, like the relationship between humans, and I'm a human geographer more than I am a physical geographer. The relationship of humans and the built environment and the space around them. And I was also a little tiny punk activist. So like I was like upset. I was like, oh, I hate that everybody has to drive everywhere, and like I love human rights and all this stuff. And so that was like the seed that planted, that turned me into an urban planner, which is not actually even what I am today. But I found out that you can help shape the built environment, and it blew my mind. And I was like, oh, it's called planning. And so I followed that thread to become an urban planner, which is also, yeah, what I said, it's not really what I am, but it is also a framework for how I approach my life and work.
Yeah, so I mean, what a beautiful background, though. And I know, like, I don't know if you know Ollie Mold, but he's also like a human geographer. That's how he first like introduces himself. And I'm like, oh, and my podcast with him was so cool too. So I'm
yes.
so looking forward to this.
Oh, geography. Oh, geography is where it's at. Pun intentional. Isn't that great? All you geographers out there.
Now this is gonna be my like next year. I should make a study on this. Like, why are geographers such cool people?
Yeah, why are we so cool?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like to me it like very much makes sense, but also like being in the urban design world, like how it can all like connect to one another, and what you do today also really calls for a good understanding of urban context. So to me, it makes very much sense what you do, even if you're not like planning, drafting things like directly.
Yeah.
A lot of the things we see in city that impact humans' lives is also very much like design interventions, which that's how I see Citi Bike. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I guess like what I would like to first for all of us to understand, to go a little bit deeper into the need and why it matters, like why we need to build such an intervention into cities. How does this support us humans and communities like in the city? So a little bit like some of the issues that we see in the cities that you think Citi Bike is also addressing.
Oh yeah. Well, I think like most cities were designed at like a certain time and place. And my context is more American cities. Um, and we in New York are the most fortunate city to have had the subway installed like ages ago. Like although, you know, with no public process, like we can talk a little bit, and I'd like to really get into like how process matters and how you can like do things better now, but and how to move forward. And but we had this like skeleton of transportation. We've got the subway, we have buses which like fill in those gaps. And then we have our greatest public space, the road, the biggest public space of all. And you know, I think city makers or decision makers, we gave up a lot in the 20th century, where we ceded this public space to vehicles in the name of progress, where people are like, this is the future and this is how we're going to get around and it gets us far. And so we gave up this hub of public space and really turned our streets into kind of like just these incredibly dangerous rivers, effectively, to like cross, all in the spirit of like having to get somewhere. And so, you know, where Citi Bike and biking came out of this, all of this in New York, was that like Bloomberg had put out Plan NYC. What was it called? I think it was called like Plan NYC 2020 or something, like Vision for the Future kind of thing. I can't remember if it had a number associated with it at the end. And his projections were like, there are going to be 1 million more people in New York City. And man, we've got a plan for that. We need housing, we need this. And like the subways were at capacity. And the roads, we learned a lesson. We're not making these roads any wider. Like, we're not going to do that. That's not the future of transportation. And so it's like, well, what can you do? What's another option here? And that's what excited me so much about biking in the first place. Was it was like, first off, I was already a cyclist. So just a little bit more background on me is that like I went to college at University of Colorado in Boulder, and that's where I was like, I had like a proto bike share. I had exposure to a proto bike share system through our environmental center, which was like, it was a little bicycle library, and I borrowed it for, sorry, I'm going personal for a second. I borrowed it for Thanksgiving long weekend, and I started riding my bike, and I was like, oh my gosh. I went to my friends and I was like, hey, do you know how fast you can get places? And Boulder has incredible bike infrastructure. They've invested a lot in it. And I was like, hey, and I was a big bus rider there because we had free bus passes at the school. And I was like, you guys, try this out. It's a bike. And I had like, you know, as a little geographer, urban planning nerd in high school, I would like walk to high school. I was like refused to drive anywhere in like the suburbs of Colorado. And I was like, I'm walking. But I still thought bikes were for dorks, because it was like mountain bikes times. I was like, oh,
I see.
Look, I want to skateboard. Anyway, fast forward to like Bloomberg era New York, this idea that like, we've got so many people, how are we going to get them around? And there was a few priorities. It was like, let's make buses like trains. So that's when we like the city launched the first select bus services, which was a BRT light, a bus rapid transit light. And then there was the bike lanes. So it was like, let's make this attractive, let's make it safe, and let's make it not this thing that's like for like brave souls, like our bike messengers and like the people who are willing to go out there and take risks, and let's make it something that everybody can do. And so the initial focus was like, let's get these bike lanes in the ground. 8th and 9th Avenue and Chelsea were like, I think those were the first protected bike lanes that the city installed. And then little by little, you were seeing them going in. And I was fortunate to be at DOT for part of that. Like, you know, I entered DOT, or New York City DOT, under the Commissioner Jeanette Sada Khan. And so like, and I was working in the bike unit, and it was like incredible. It's like, here we go, bike lanes. And then you got the bike lanes, great. And it's like, all right, now we need the tool to do the job. And so there's like this beautiful match here of on-street infrastructure and then access to the tool. And Citi Bike, that's the gap that Citi Bike fills in. And so for me, in my professional transition from bike lanes to bikes, which is it's not even like a crazy transition, I was like so excited because I was like, let's talk about how we give people access to this amazing tool. And like, I used to have my own bike. I do have my own bike again because I have a toddler now, so I have a little seat for him.
Yeah.
But I had my own bike for the longest time, and then I realized like Citi Bike fills in this gap. Like, first off, you don't have to take your bike inside. You don't have to have a place to lock your bike in, your personal bike. Also, you never have to maintain your bike. Also, you don't have to fumble with your lock, which was one of my most annoying things to do as a cyclist. My hands always got so dirty and you have to bend over, and I'm always wearing dresses and skirts, and I was like, oh. And like, you know, docking a Citi Bike is like, boom, I'm done. I don't have to worry about anything. And so like, it's an amazing, amazing resource that fills in these gaps of like getting to a train or getting somewhere that the train just doesn't go. Like crossing a park. Like I live near Prospect Park. And so sometimes I have to go to the other side of the park. And instead of doing like a circuitous train route, guess what? I can bike across the park. And I can decide to take a different mode home. I'm a big multimodalist, and I think that that's a way we should think about transportation too, is like use the best tool for the job. Sometimes it's a bike. It's a one-way bike trip. Sometimes it's a subway. Sometimes it's the bus. Sometimes it's bike to IKEA and then take a Lyft home because you bought so much stuff. You don't need a car both ways. And so yeah, if you think of it as this like transportation ecosystem, there's so many tools at your disposal, and it's really, if you like access them all in that way, you've got everything you need. And to think only in the private vehicle, personal transportation lens really limits you. Also, driving is not fun.
Like we could go into like the health problems and all of that like also like
categorically unfun. Does everybody, I mean, like, okay, well, you're rarely in the situation in a car commercial where you're driving on an empty road that like
with a Ferrari,
or like somehow you're driving in the city on an empty road and there's parking where you have to go. This like sometimes you see the commercials and they're like, oh, they went to lunch in a car for some reason and there was parking. And then there's like a train overhead to be like, we like trains too, but we want you to buy our car. Anyway, all right, long answer to your question, I guess.
So I love this because it gives great context. And as a New Yorker, I kind of saw like the evolution of all of this like happening, right? Like to your point, we set up our lives in such a way. I also have a 4-year-old toddler. So I'm like, I want to be walking everywhere. Like if I need other modes of transportation, I can pick that, but otherwise I don't want my like day-to-day thing dependent on any vehicle. Like so like I live in downtown Brooklyn. Our office is in Brooklyn Navy Yard. My daughter goes to school like right next to BAM, right? So we do this like triangle of walking, which is like each way is like 10, 15 minutes, right? But there are days where you're kind of like, oh, I need to move faster. I don't necessarily need a car. I just need access to something that will take me there faster. And this is when I remember like we've been in Brooklyn Navy Yard since 2015, and there was, I mean, nothing. Not even like nothing, right? And that we saw like the growth of that, and then suddenly now there's a great bike lane right in front of us as we like exit like throughout like pushing out.
I like when you say suddenly, but I will say that was years in the works, and I can tell you the history of it and all the different modes, like the iterations it took to become a capital project. So it does seem sudden, and you know, the built environment appears suddenly, but it actually often happens in little bits of claiming space. But we can talk about that later. But please,
I love that you said that, because I think that's how we're very quick to judge and whether something or not is working, or if we're doing something about it, right? Like, so like I remember before downtown Brooklyn, we were in Fort Greene and a Citi Bike station popped up right in front of our house, right? So like, this is so cool. So we became a member, and then like getting to Navy Yard, we didn't like it, right? Not because of Citi Bike, but the road. And then and you're kind of like, we're so impatient, and just because, maybe it's our generation, maybe because it's like year 2022, but we everything wants to happen systematically, integrated way, and launch at the same time, which is not possible, especially
Yes.
when you're working with like multiple complex systems in a city scale. So I think the appreciation and the understanding also grew over time. Like whenever something launches first or something happens, there's so much criticism and feedback and something. And then like over time, we really understand the need, and everything starts making more sense because everything becomes more and more integrated as you all continue to do your work. So I think there is like this two stream like experience happens in like parallel, where like people who are like making it happen and all the work that it takes to like make it happen, and us the consumers, where we're kind of like, well, why isn't there like a station there, right? Like we're like
Right, right.
immediately
Yeah, I think
um,
like there's a couple of things here. And I know you were telling a story about how maybe you want to ride a bike with your kid, but I feel like but I think like there are a lot of industries that have a lot of work go into them, and time and effort, and there's like a lot of coverage of them. Like for example, the film industry. Like we know way too much about that industry. We care about their awards. We care about who's doing the best. It doesn't make sense. And if
so true.
if I was a visual artist, which everybody kind of is, I could be, like I always wanted to make this thing where like at the end of a movie, what do you see? The credits. Everybody who had something to do with the movie, from like the caterers to like the lawyers to this to that. Everything you actually see in your built environment pretty much has that amount of people behind it. And so what I wanted
Yeah,
to do was create rolling credits for pieces of infrastructure where it's like, here is the project manager, here is the commissioner, here are
I
the
love
elected
that.
officials, here are the people who painted that line on the street, here are the people who made that paint. Like all this stuff, like the amount of work that goes into it and the time, because what we experience as like the public moving around is like, is that things pop up out of nowhere, and the reaction to change in public space in the built environment is like surprise. And then this is like a lot of kind of what my work is focused on, is that like you always hear, like if you talk to somebody, they'll say, oh, they opened up a Starbucks over there, or like they're building a Trader Joe's, they're building a building over there, they're making a bike lane, and you're like, oh yeah, who's they? Like who's the they?
Yeah.
And so I think that like in my work, like what I've really tried to open up is the fact that there are so many authors to the built environment that you see. And
Yeah.
kind of one of the things I would say is like you're taught to read your landscape just by like living and going through it. There's no formal education, right? So but you read it just like your alphabet. You're like, yes, fire hydrant, lamppost, dog, thing, and then
That poo in New York
yeah,
City.
and then when new things are introduced, you're like, new letter. Like, what is that? Like, I don't know what that is. And then like the people who are nerds who are like, oh, me, I read the dictionary every night. Like, I know all the new words and whatever, you know. They're like, oh, I've been waiting for that. And then like everybody else is like, what is that? I've never seen it before. And so this like perception of like what the built environment can be is like, it's like it's stuck in like whatever time you existed in, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so like there's a lot of, and it's not just transportation that like suffers from this framing. I think housing and zoning suffer from this too, because people are like born into a space and understand their space in a certain way, and then there's this attachment, a personal attachment to like what it looked like when you first saw it or when you first experienced it.
Yeah.
And that like, and that and then like when a change is made without this knowledge of like how many people it takes to create a change, the reason for the change, like a million more people, like we need housing. And so
Yeah.
like I love like to use the example, like I used to live in Greenpoint, and like I went to planning school, so yeah, I knew about the rezoning of the Greenpoint waterfront, uh Greenpoint Williamsburg waterfront. Like that was
Yeah.
like, I knew it was coming because I'm in the industry, right? And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
people, like people who I knew were like journalists or like comedians or whatever. Oh my gosh, look at this. Oh, this neighborhood's changed so much. I was like, first off, you got here 2 years ago. That building was planned 10 years ago, actually. Like that rezoning happened. And like, yes, that's how you're experiencing it. But like, but it's actually not coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think you touched upon something so important, which I also feel like it's actually, and as you mentioned too, like not helping the architecture or generally the built environment industry, right? Like to your point, like there are other industries where in film, it's so human and it's personable, relatable, right? Like we love watching behind the scenes, right? Like there's so much like we understand if making a movie takes 4 years, as much as it disappoints us and we're waiting for it, we're like rooting for it, like, oh yeah, they're gonna create something great. But because it's so human and like it has been made personable, even though like not necessarily Oscars are very like, the
I mean,
awards of
but
access.
it's personal and aspirational where you're like, me,
Yeah.
I'm wearing that fancy outfit. Yeah, there's
But,
something
like,
there that they've I mean, I bet it's just storytelling. Like that's their industry is storytelling. So it's that connection.
That's true.
Yeah.
And in architecture and like urban design, like these fields, I think like I don't know how this happened over time. We like in another podcast we were talking about like architectural psychology was a commonly used term in 1970s, and I was like, what happened? Like why isn't it anymore? So, and as I came into the like design space as an outsider. My background is in like engineering and finance, and then like slowly I find myself like more in like design strategy role. But my biggest fascination when I started first working with like architects or like planners, was that the language was so sophisticated. Like I did a master's in finance just so that I could understand finance people because I'm like,
oh
if
my
I've ever
gosh.
read it, like,
Talk about my weak spot. Like, please teach me everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, if I'm gonna be in business, I want to understand some of what's happening here.
Yeah.
But that's how I felt like exposed to architecture, and I'm like, this is so bizarre because it's such a human field. Like in the end, it all started because us humans needed shelters, and then we needed to coexist together. And so it's very much something that is done for everybody, but yet the language discipline somehow it with all the legal and regulations and
even just the word typology, you're like, what human says that? People will be like, typing, like what's that? And then you're like, vernacular, and they're like, that means it's yours, you made that up. And you're like, what? Like you could call it like slang housing. That would maybe make more sense than like slang building types than vernacular, like typology or something like that.
True.
Right?
Like how did we like alienate it so much that it started to become unrelatable, and therefore the more that happened, the more we were like, oh, they're doing that. And this is like why we also like very much explore participatory design practices in architecture and how it needs to kind of like come back, and how it shouldn't just live in like public service or service design. Like this is very and which is so funny because sometimes when we find ourselves really like trying to educate a lot of developers on this, like when we say like community engagements, they think we're talking about community board meetings, and we're like,
no. I love it. Yeah, I'm glad we're getting into this because I think too, like there's a few things. Like first off, the US has like a civics problem where the way you are taught to participate is pure voting. It's just voting. You never hear about anything else. And like we can barely do that. We can barely show up to vote. There's nothing about like public meetings, all this stuff. And so like, at least for planning or the planning profession, the 20th century brought some like top down, pretty awful decision making that ruined a lot of people's lives, particularly Black and brown communities.
Yeah.
Like destroyed their, like tore through their homes and gave everybody asthma. You're like, cool, what a big mistake. And then and then as an industry, we took this shift where we were like, okay, we gotta ask. We gotta engage, we gotta do this. And like it became very like a one-on-one model. And now that whole thing has been kind of I don't know. It's turned, it like went unchecked or like became niche, and then it turned into just this community board process. And like these engaged engagement strategies that overvalue certain voices, are not open and transparent and accessible, and like become a box to check. And so like, I think it's really important when we talk about how you engage and who you engage, what that can potentially look like.
Exactly.
And when to move forward. So I think that some community engagement is set up in this way where you're asking just the complete wrong questions, and you end up with like a binary almost of like yes, no. And from the public experience, like all that's left to do is resist a change.
Right.
Instead of
exactly.
like being a part of it, because of like how kind of broken the process is. And so there's some issues here. One is that there's so many authors, and if every author had a process, that's very difficult. It's very difficult. And I think planners and architects and everybody really want to open up their processes, but the public gets exhausted. So like you can overplan a neighborhood. Like for example, like East Harlem, there's like an East Harlem neighborhood plan that Hester Street put together. I bet it was almost like 10 years ago now. And like, and then, so they had done all this work to do planning, but it was a community driven plan. And I don't know how it influenced development and all this stuff. But then like, then you've got like, you know, maybe DOT wants to come in and say like, hey, where do you want your bike lanes? And they're like, dude, we just spent all this time, of the people who are engaged, like we spent all this time already telling you what we wanted. Why are you coming and asking again? And then like you could see a developer coming in saying like, we're doing one plot of land. Let's get your input. And the people who show up to participate in these events, they get exhausted and they say like, where's our thing that we told you we wanted? Why are you asking again? Because there's no communication and research of like what's going on. And then in the meantime, most people who can't actually show up to participate to whatever like sessions we've like developed have no idea what's going on. And then when the thing shows up, it comes up out of nowhere. And so like what I did at DOT was try to engage that like the unengaged. And so I'll give a little story about like when we were first launching Bike Share, we did a ton of community meetings. And I'm specifically saying Bike Share because it was before we had a sponsor, before Citi Bike called Citi Bike. And we did this workshop at Medgar Evers College. And I remember being in the workshop and I was like, oh, it's good that we're over here. It was like geographically, we had reached a lot of areas. And then, but I was watching like who was coming into the meeting and I was like, these are all people I know and I expected to see here. And then all the students, they were like walking outside of the room, back and forth, like going to their classes and doing all this stuff. And I was like, oh no, that's who I want to talk to. Like those guys out there. Like, and so while we had like an amazing process, an amazing conversation in that workshop, and it did fulfill a very certain need, I was like, man, what if we set a table up there and then talk to them? And so like that's what I tried to do with the street ambassadors. It was basically like, let's take some of our plans and our processes of like what would have had a public meeting and turn it into something that's bite-sized, easy to engage, and like you can talk to tons of people. So, and we gave people swag. It was like, thank you for your time. Here's a tote bag, you know, like, and you know, a tote bag you can wash, the good kind of tote bag. I was like very particular about what tote bags we had out. And so we made it like really simple. And then you had like a completely different experience because people who show up to a meeting are more informed. To an extent, you know, they definitely have an opinion already. They have a formed opinion before they arrive. And then they certainly care a lot. Nobody's going to show up and not care. Right. There's something about like the people who are showing up, and you know, there's like the Leslie Knope quote where she's like at a community meeting and she's like, when I hear people yelling at me, I hear people caring at me very loudly. And like, we set ourselves up for the structure to just be like, yell at me, yell at me, yell at me, even though like, I'm a person, this is actually very hard. I'm trying to do something. Oh, please yell at me more. And so, um, uh, like, when you change that structure, you change who you're talking to, and how you're engaging, you have like a much more balanced representation of like what's going on and what people's opinions really are. And then there's a little bit of that education piece of like, hey, we've got a menu of options. And so something we would do with the street ambassadors, it was like, we would introduce new features and actually say what they were called. And we always joked like, you know, people will order what they're familiar with. Like, people will constantly ask for a speed bump, when really street design has evolved way beyond speed bumps, and you can do so much traffic calming that is not a speed bump. Like, oh my gosh, you can divert traffic and like make each road one way and then like create a bike boulevard, and then like there goes your speeding problem. But that's not what people are going to ask for, except that planners want to be asked for that. They're like, please ask us for a bike boulevard. And you're like, no. People are going to tell you their pain point, their problem right here. And then you use your expertise to actually solve that problem. And so like, we would introduce new features and kind of gauge people's interest so that like people would know what a neck down is, what a raised crosswalk is, blah, 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 you know? And the ambassadors could talk to like 300 people in a day sometimes. And like, man, if you have a community meeting with 300 people, then you feel like you've got really give yourself a pat on the back, you know? And all that said, like, still when you install stuff, and like DOT would then go present to the community board and say like, we talked to all these people. If we didn't engage with the community board early and say, we're going to do a process, they would feel very threatened by that information. Like, they're like, who did you talk to? Did you talk to my cousin? Did you talk to this person? And so like, for areas where we were like, okay, we need to build a lot of trust here, we would go early and say, we're going to do a process. Tell us where we should go. And that's a good way, I think, to engage a community board, where you're like, hey, you are experts in your neighborhood. Like, what are the hubs? Where are people? Who's important? Who should I talk to? And so we would like go, we did this in Bed-Stuy, and we were like, where should we go? And so we listened to where they said, we went here, 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 here. And then we did like 70 outreach events, you know, little pop-ups. Some days it's 10 people, some days it's 30 people. Overall, that ended up, for the whole process, ended up being 700 people. And the team consistently went to the community board meeting. So at the board meeting itself, you could also participate at the meeting. Which was the community board's idea, by the way. They were like, why don't you set up a table here? And we were like, wow, we hadn't actually even thought about that. Good idea. And so then ultimately, when we presented the findings, we were met with this like, here's what happened. Somebody got up and said, if you were everywhere, my son, who's very involved, he hasn't seen this at all. I've never seen you guys. Like, how am I supposed to trust you? And somebody else from the community board stood up and said, no, they've been here. Like, if you haven't seen them, you weren't paying attention. And so we had that, like, that we built the trust. We had that kind of defense of like, and then it became a conversation among them instead of like a pile-on against DOT. And we were able to install some important intersection redesigns and traffic calming measures because of that effort. And like, big picture, the outreach piece took like, you know, a year to like be able to do all that, to get the conversation going, to do the stuff. And in the meantime too, it's like understanding the other pieces of data that DOT had, which was like the Vision Zero intersection, priority intersections, like what are the most dangerous intersections? And then you use all that information together. And I think like there are certain fields that get this, like, you know, UX is like the buzz, you know, word, right? And you said like service design. And like, I think we all have to take on that type of thinking and then change how we ask people questions. Instead of saying like, where would you like a bike boulevard? You say like, what are the problems you're seeing? And then you're like, and here are my tools that I can use that are going to solve your problems, and they're going to look weird. And so as an industry, that's, I think, the direction that we should be going as far as participation goes. And I want to just give a shout out to, I had an intern, I'm sorry, an intern.
No, go ahead.
Once who was studying like communication design. Her name is Yvonne Chow, and now she works for the sanitation department. And I was like, oh, hey, you know UX? Like, what should we be asking? What should we be doing? I was like, come on. And she gave me like this really great example of like a supermarket. Like you set the tone, you set the scope, and you're like, tell me about like the supermarket. What would make your experience better? Where do you have pain points? And I thought about my own supermarket, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. Like, why are there two sets of vegetables over here? And why do I have to go this way? These things should be next to each other. You know, like all this stuff. And it was so easy for me to think of like where I was expecting things to be and where my cart would get stuck. And like, I felt like those were questions I could answer. And I'm no supermarket layout expert, you know, and I was like, that's how we need to ask questions, is like, tell me your pain points, and then like set a scope, tell me your pain points, and then like solve these pain points if possible.
Well, I mean, I have to say, I absolutely love this overall example of community engagements and participatory design for many various reasons. Number one, you already had mentioned process before you started talking about this, and it's very important to talk about process, because I think what really needs to be understood is that if you really want to have a human-centered, community-led approach, you have to adapt it to your own industry, how you practice it, right? Like everyone's industry and product is different. Teams are different. How we communicate is different. So there has to be a process that is inclusive of the needs of the team that is going to execute, as well as the audience that we're trying to like work with, right? So in that sense, that adaptation of process and learning curve over time, like almost being a little bit like agnostic on like how you do it in the beginning. Like you started out with like workshops, and then you realize, wait, no, like this is not working. Like really being agile and adapt to make it work. I think that example is like beautiful. And then really also like the fact that you highlighted how we ask things and how we listen and how we communicate, right? Like we talked about like the jargons and like the sophisticated language already, like that is already maybe creating some bias or intimidation or whatever it might be if it's used that way. And then there's the problem of how we ask questions. Like we even see this in like consumer goods industry, where like, which has been doing consumer surveys for so long, and yet in surveys I sometimes see questions like, would you pay X for this? And you're like, no, yes. Like what is it about like in that moment, to the person answering it, that question does, or like, how did that make you feel? And you're like, that's such a hard question. Like, do we really know how we feel every single moment, like when things happen? Anyway, but like how we ask things and how our role is actually as designers or planners is really synthesizing that information. Because even like we see, like when we say co-design, sometimes people get territorial a little bit, like designers or architects, like, oh, but like we're the experts. Like, what does that mean? Like, are people going to come together and like try to design a thing? You're like, no, it's about having people as partners in the process. So your job as the expert is to really synthesize what they're telling you, because they will tell it in the way that, exactly to your point, speed bump is a way that they know they can slow down things. And that's their actual need there. And it's the expert's role to like get that and then show alternate ways of like how the slowing down can happen and communicate that. Right. So that was a great example, I think, to put that. So that all of that calls for a process design, like over time, that could like adapt to needs. And especially when you're working in an urban context with so many complex systems and diverse communities involved, it is even more important to be able to do that. I think Citi Bike is a great way to like implement that, just because also there is a tool that is more human scale and more relatable too, right? Like suddenly, because when we have like big phrases or words or big sites, even like it's harder for people to maybe understand, like, how does this relate to me? Like, what is my action here, right? Like even we see this in like environmental issues, climate change. Like, what do I do about it, right? So I love that how Citi Bike makes it like human scale. Like the problem is more understandable through something that is human scale. So it's also like a beautiful implementation and product of such a process too. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight those like thing like the synthesis aspect, the process design aspect, and really increasing the relatability and bringing something human scale to the mix. Like all of those are great examples of how this can be done successfully. And obviously it takes a lot of time, and every moment is not a success. Success is built over time. But yeah,
and yeah, I'm glad you're just bringing it back to Citi Bike, and I want to talk a little bit about the difference between my work at DOT and then what I'm doing at Citi Bike a little bit, because you know, like Citi Bike is a public-private partnership, but people's experience seeing it on the street is that probably they think that Citibank owns it. You know, they're like, oh, the Citibank bikes, and you're like, oh, so if you were like, who runs this? People would be like, Citibank? I don't know. Like, I'd be curious to know what people think. People are very surprised to learn that Lyft owns the Citi Bike now. And that you can actually open up the Lyft app and check out a Citi Bike on the Lyft app as well. So like, I think that part's really like surprising to a lot of people. But what people really don't know is that it's actually DOT, New York City DOT, that determines where all of the docks go. And so when we talk about participation in Citi Bike, I think that there's an interesting process here. It's the chance for you to like engage in where docks are placed comes at the planning phase that DOT manages and controls. Right now, which is we're recording this in December, so just so for if this comes out later, sorry that it's probably the window of opportunity is closed. Right now, DOT has a feedback portal open for East Flatbush expansion, and the people who know about it and have been participating. But this is that window of opportunity, and the street investors were actually out with part of my street team, the Citi Bike street team, in like the fall to like engage people on street to talk about where these docks should go. And then there's another whole process that's going to happen, which then DOT will crunch the numbers and then they do it like what's effectively I think of as like Tetris meets operation of like where can these docks fit? It's like, okay, where is the sidewalk wide enough? Is there space? What's the land use? Okay, should it go on the street? And then all knowing that like each station should be a 5-minute walk from wherever you are. Like that's the other piece of it, is like effectively you lay a grid over the city and then you say like within these squares there needs to be one station so that you can always be a 5-minute walk from a station. And then, you know, I say Tetris meets operation because sometimes you're going to be like here to hit a spot, like no.
Yeah.
Like, oh, there's a fire hydrant there. And then when it comes time for installation, that's when people are experiencing it, the popping up out of nowhere. And so what my role is now at Citi Bike is part of like letting illuminating that process. Like I do meetings with community partners or just long-term community organizations, community-based organizations, to say like, hey, here, this is coming, here's the process. But now like we're talking about like how are we going to be like a good neighbor? Like what does it mean when these bikes show up? And so I have like this kind of suite of programs that are all about building access into the system, because people have perceptions on like who biking is for. You could ask, and this is my experience at DOT. If you go to the Upper East Side, they're like, biking is for poor people. And then if you go to like a low-income neighborhood, people are, biking is for rich people. And you're like, well, that's interesting. It sounds like biking is for everyone. But there's very real fears associated like with change that, you know, and so people are like, oh, what's going on? So I have like a suite of tools and it's about how do we build that trust and engagement and this kind of ownership over that new tool that is going to be soon to be available for you. Like you don't have to do that when like a bus line is updated. People kind of already know how to use the bus. They know how to use the train. Like the 7 train extension, people were like, yes, new station. I know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so rare that that kind of big infrastructure thing happens, but this like lean, agile, like bikes, everything about it is like so agile that like
Yeah.
people are like, huh, how do I access that? So we have a community grants program where it opens in the early on in the year for community-based organizations that can apply, and they can do anything. Like they can be related to anything. Like, and so it's at this point right now when I'm saying this, our grant is a $10,000 grant, and it's kind of rooted in this work that we did with the Better Bike Share Partnership, and that Bed-Stuy Restoration really led the charge on about like how do we build trust into this tool? How do we grow ridership of how do we of like Black and brown communities who might not see this as something for them? And so one of the things was like engaging organizations to set up rides and stuff and say like, hey, we can use this however we want, you know? And so we engage organizations who are like, we're like, what do you want to do? What do you maybe want to do with these bikes? And so like some of our grantees this year, we worked with a group called Active Plus up in Washington Heights, and their focus is active. It's not necessarily active transportation, it's like healthy living. And so they're using the bikes to get people out and get people active in Harlem and Washington Heights. And then we've had a group, the RISE project, which is part of the Center for Court Innovation, and their focus is on dismantling or like, you know, interventions when it comes to domestic violence. And so their work is heavy, their work is hard, and it's really rooted in like, if you're familiar with the Center for Court Innovation, it's like alternatives to incarceration, mediation, credible messengers, like all this stuff of like, that's really takes a lot of time and heart. And what they were doing as grantees is like, they were doing these community bike rides, but the purpose was bringing people together, working with a cohort of people, and like, and it was like taking up space, showing up and saying like, they're working with the Cure Violence sites to say like, hey, listen, like we're out here and we have a community solution to this problem. And so it was a completely different use of the bikes. And that's, I think, the beauty of like what we can do. And so we have this budget, and then we give them like access to the system in some way. So we'll do like a bike drop if it's a big ride. We'll do or we'll give them a code so they can unlock the bikes themselves, depending on like using, again, the best tool for the job. And this year we did like kind of surveys. People have to sign a waiver. A waiver. That's the real word. They sign a waiver when they do the get on the bikes, and we have it as a Google form. And I was like, our program's reaching our intended audiences. And so we did like a quick optional survey at the beginning. And so like, we're like, do these programs, are we working to build trust with Black and brown communities? And it was like, turns out, yes, like these programs were primarily like demographically matching who we were trying to reach, because it was like programs put on by organizations that were from the community. And then like we asked this question, like, you know, rate, like, is Citi Bike for me? Citi Bike for people like me? And people responded like, yes, like on like a scale of 1 to 5. Most people did a 4 and a 5. And so this idea of like, who is this tool for? How is it being used? And how can you engage with it? I think that's like the purpose of those grants and that programming. And then also we have our $5 a month membership, or reduced fare bike share membership, which is for people who live in NYCHA, who receive SNAP benefits, and who are members of select community development credit unions. And we are at 15,000 members right now. So like, that's huge. That's incredible. And like, and we find like the reduced fare bike share members take e-bikes more than the full price paying members. So it's very interesting to see like, they access like who's going where, what tool are people using for the job again. And so that's a lot of like the work now is like, there's participation pre-implementation, right? And that's like what a planner does. But then there's like the programming that opens it up, like thinking about like a library. Like you can make a beautiful building, but like you have to make sure it's an inviting place and that it's open, and that it like, and that the programming meets the needs of of the people.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process. It's not this
Yeah.
like static thing that launched. And this is a great example of that. And I think it should be a case study for many other more like maybe urban or even like governmental, like high level things that are going to come into our cities. Like we were working on a project with like Department of Labor 2 years ago, and we found ourselves like they had a big need of like engaging CBOs in a tool that they were like gonna launch. And we basically just landed on a big distrust by CBOs who were like reached out so many times and nothing came into fruition. And so the fact that you gave the example of like how you go in early and build that relationship and really also work with them to identify the means, and that building trust takes time. Like we found ourselves as like a third party mediator almost to like help things moving. But you know, in the end, like all when you want to really engage communities, you do need the CBOs, and you also need to have a, in addition to the process of like that like engagement during planning, you do need to have like an ongoing strategy on how you continually engage CBOs to also really have like authentic, build an authentic relationship with humans too. And I think I love, you know, how, I mean, of course, like I see the benefit of Citi Bike of like, yes, like it's a preventative way for like overuse of cars, which is like one aspect of it, but also like the example you gave of like how community comes together. I think that's the beauty of like introducing human scale interventions in urban context to like enable those moments. So yeah, I think I honestly feel like I'm sure this is like a case study that exists, but many other like governmental departments and city people can like take this as a use case in the implementation of that. So thank you for all that work.
Oh
I
yeah,
just want to like highlight
this
that.
actually just reminded me of something that was worth shouting out. A podcast. Sorry, it's another podcast. If you're familiar with Lizzie Mogul, who's like a
Yeah.
she's like a counter cartographer. She's awesome. And she did this series, Views from the Watershed, about like how water gets to New York City. And there's an episode, and it's just it's a mini podcast, everybody. So like don't like listen to it. It's not gonna be, you're not gonna have to keep listening to it forever. But there's an episode where they talk about the upstate community and their experiences, like being like, what, we're just the suppliers for New York City's water, like you don't just treat us as this resources, and that this trust building that had to be done to like, and the reframing of like stewardship of the land, and then like also just like being treated with respect by a government agency, like that wasn't going to just come in and stomp in and say like this is necessary. It was like this idea of like being treated with respect. And so I think that like it takes a lot of time to build trust. I do also think trust can be easily broken, and that when we talk about these like entities building trust among one another, I think it's also just important to say that like, again, that it's all different. It's humans making decisions. And so like I think like sometimes you're passing through an institution and it's you that has a relationship with somebody, and that like you can do your best in your institution to like institutionalize the way you're doing things, but like sometimes it's very relationship based on like on that trust, and like they might trust just you but not the broader agency. And so just something to think about.
Definitely. Like how do we systemize that, and how does it become like an easily adopted and accessible playbook almost to the entire like team, and not just the person who kind of spearheaded all those efforts.
Yeah.
I do want to be mindful of your time. Oh my God, I think we could chat all day.
We could talk forever.
But to wrap up, for anybody in any field who would like to make progress, push boundaries, shift things up a bit, what would be your advice to them?
I think like learn to know and like respect people. And I think like I didn't know about the field of behavioral science, or like, and I also didn't know about what's it called? Not theories of change. Oh, organizational psychology.
Mm.
Those two things, I think, are kind of necessary tools for creating change, is like change management, understanding. And it's really about like understanding where people are coming from and like emotionally where they're at and like why they're perceiving you in a certain way and why they're perceiving this change in a certain way. And then like empathizing with them. And then again, seeing how you can take this step forward together where people are feeling ownership. Yeah. And so, yeah, if you're just starting out, look into both of those things, because I'm like, oh, I wish I had studied more of that. And you can always keep studying. If you're not just starting out, study it now. It's great. Like there's always a chance. Like I didn't miss the boat. I just have like I'll just catch the next boat. Like, right. I'm like I'll study my behavioral science now. So yeah, I think that's my
I love that. I do wish somebody had told me that like 10 years ago. So I'm like the one who caught the later boat.
You start now, and in 10 years, you'll have done it for 10 years. So it's never too late too.
Thank you so much, Inbar. This was such a treat. I loved it.
Great.
Thank you so much for making the time.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, everybody.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.